So I have a 15-year-old daughter, and the other day I asked her to do an experiment with her social world at school. I said, I want you to observe for 1 week all the interactions that you see among your peers and your acquaintances. I just want you to be an observer of adolescent life, and I'd like you to figure out what you think is the unseen motivation driving all of adolescence. It was a big question, and I actually didn't have any idea what she would say to that. I had just got back from a conference, and we had talked about that most people are motivated by something. So you think about morning rush hour. Why is everybody getting in their cars and going to work? Well, we got to make money to support our families. There's a positive motivation behind earning funds to support our families. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the only motive that's driving people. And so I wanted to know what's going on in the world of adolescence. And so I asked her this question, and a week later, she came back to me and said, Dad, I know what it is. I've watched all sorts of social groups, different ages, different genders, different personalities, and I have a sense of what's driving all these teenagers. And so I said, okay, well, what'd you find out? What is it? She said, Dad, I think it's attention. I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, I think it drives everything that these teens do. I think it's why we put on the clothes that we put on in the morning. It drives the stories that we tell, the jokes that we tell. It drives who looks at who during a conversation. In fact, at the end of the day, when all these teens are going to bed, she was saying, I think it's the one thing that they're evaluating their entire day off of. Who noticed me? Who paid attention to me? And I thought Anna's observation was really, really astute. And I don't know if it's just teenagers that this applies to. In fact, I was just thinking about my own world. I might not crave attention the way that we would think many teens do, but I do find there are days where I go to bed at night and I feel like I wasn't seen, or I wasn't heard, or I wasn't understood. In ministry, I end up doing a lot of this. I talk a lot, but I listen a lot. There's always people in my office. I'm going out to lunch and coffee with people all the time, and so I do a lot of listening. And sometimes that gets really draining. The other day, there was a guy who wanted to tell me about his dream. Now, dreams are interesting. I have lots of dreams. I find them interesting. There's lots of dreams in the Bible. That's an interesting thing. But the reality is, when it comes to telling other people about your dreams, you probably want to keep that about 90 seconds or less. Most dreams are not that interesting to other people. Well, this guy, he just wouldn't stop talking to me about this crazy world, and there was a city, and there was interesting, like a tornado or something, and these people were coming out of buildings trying to hurt him. Okay, I get that. That was meaningful to you, but that is not worth half an hour of my time. I was actually standing in church, and everybody had left the auditorium, and he was still just going on and on and on about this dream. And finally, I just had to say, I have to go. And that what I felt in that moment was there was an imbalance. I'd been giving him attention because he needed that. That's fine. We all need it, but I hadn't really received any all day. And that's what I find in the adult world is that, when you go a full day or 2 or 3 days and no one has noticed you or listened to you to really know what's going on in your life, it's draining. It makes us feel alone. And so today what I'd like to explore is, as we follow Jesus, one of the things that I feel like we would notice is Jesus was a really good listener. I think that skill is going the way of the dinosaur. A lot of times I assume that most people, or many people at least, that come to church feel like they belong. But that's not necessarily true. Every single week, imagine how many people are walking through the doors of your church and they're smiling and putting on that happy face, but just underneath that wonderful veneer, there's this sense of nobody knows who I am. I don't have friends. I think this happens way more than we realize. I remember when I was, I think I was 16 years old, and my friends and I went to a movie, and we got home, and my dad said, "How did it go?" I said, "It was great." And he said, "Do you think everybody felt involved and included?" I was like, "Oh yeah, they all did." And he said, "Well, what about Chris?" And Chris was this new guy had just moved into town, and I said, "Oh yeah, Chris was great. He loves being part of the friend group." And my dad said, "Well, I've just noticed Chris always sits on the end." And I was defiant and defensive. You don't know what you're talking about, Dad. I know my group. Well, a few months later in that summer, I remember Chris coming up to me and saying, "Hey, I got to be honest, this has been a really rough year for me. Even though I smile, I feel like nobody knows me. I feel like I have no friends." And so I had to admit that my dad was right. Well, I think that happens all the time. There are so many people just dying to be seen, dying to be known, dying to be heard. And the reality is, because collectively speaking, we have lost some of our skills in being with people and listening to others, we're creating a lot of people who simply feel alone. And so as we follow Jesus, one thing that we learn is he was really, really good at listening to people. If we're not careful, we become the social equivalent of black holes. So you remember what black holes are from your middle school science classes? Black holes are this phenomenon in the universe where a star dies. So basically, a star has two forces, which are generally creating the energy to make it sustain itself. Well, one force would be radiation, which is pushing the heat and the warmth outward, and the other force would be gravity, which is pulling everything inward. Well, as a star gets older, usually the radiation goes out first, and then what's left is gravity, and so it just starts sucking everything into itself. And so it pulls light, it pulls other planets, it pulls anything in its orbit into itself. Well, we can be like that. You could be like that. You could be in the middle of a conversation and you probably won't even know that's happening, but you are just sucking all of the attention and all of the energy of those 3 or 4 people onto yourself, and you might feel great because, oh yeah, this is great, I'm telling a funny story and everybody's laughing, but those 3 or 4 people, honestly, they're probably really, really drained. So without realizing it, a lot of us have really lost our ability to live the Jesus way when it comes to listening to others. So let's pause there and reflect a bit on that thought. So the text I'd like to open up today is from Philippians 2. So here's Paul is reflecting on the way of Jesus, and there's a sentence, there's a lot in there, but there's one sentence that has been so captivating to me for so many years. It occurs in we'll start in verse 3. Paul says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." That last line is so important. Don't look to your own interests. That word "looking" is this word that in the ancient world meant like you're out on the horizon, like carefully observing animals or other potential threats in your world, trying to assess your territory. Like it's a very deliberate kind of look. And so what Paul's telling us is that we are supposed to look with that kind of intent to the interests of other people. I mean, here's the truth. You've got TV shows that you like, and you've got sports that you like, and you've got hobbies, and you've got music that you like to listen to, and all those things really matter to you. But the person sitting next to you, honestly, they don't care about half that stuff. They've got their own sports and TV shows and movies and music that they like. And so if I'm only talking to you about Michael Jordan, you're going to get really bored. I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan. It's one of my interests. Or if I go on and on and on and on about my kids, again, you're going to be okay for a few minutes, but eventually you're like, "Phil, you got to turn the corner. Well, so many of us are not practicing this verse. Paul is saying you have to develop the capacity to be interested in what someone else is interested in. In fact, the way that this verse falls in the flow of thought in this passage is super interesting. So he's actually talking about the progression of spiritual maturity. So at the beginning of the text, he says, therefore, if any of you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion. So these are like prerequisite steps of following Jesus. Like he's saying, you know what this feels like. You know that feeling of compassion when you see someone that needs help. You know that feeling of you get this tenderness and this mercy that you sense in your heart. He's saying those are really good things, but they're not the end goal. They're baby steps in early Christian faith. He's saying, but you got to keep going. So the next step in verse 2, he says, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit, and of one mind. So in other words, he's saying that the next step to personal growth is interpersonal growth. So it's great if you develop your own prayer life and you develop this affection you have for the Lord. Yes, that's wonderful. But Paul is saying the next step in spiritual maturity is you have to learn how to treat people the way that Jesus treated people. In fact, the next line, so he talks about this prerequisite stuff, and then he gets to what I'm talking about here is like, don't look out for your own interests, but look out for the interests of others. Well, the very next line in verse 5, he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. In other words, he doesn't say that we should be interested in other people's interests just because that's a nice thing to do. He's saying you should show interest in the hobbies and TV shows and interesting memories of your neighbor because that's what Jesus did. This whole series is about following Jesus. Believing in Jesus is one thing. Following Jesus is actually a very different thing. Following Jesus involves walking behind him and observing what did he do. And if we were to be his apprentices 2,000 years ago and spend these 3 years following around in his footsteps with a notepad taking notes, one thing we would notice is that Jesus was dialed into people. It was amazing how whoever was in front of him became the whole world. This is particularly pops off the page to me in Luke 7 when there's a crowd of people leaving the city. It's a funeral procession, and then there's a crowd of people entering the city. It's a town called Nain, and that's Jesus and all of his followers, a big crowd. So you have hundreds of people in this just mass of crowds converging, but the text says that Jesus saw her, this widow, so she's already lost her husband, and the funeral's for her son, and the text says that Jesus saw her, and then his heart went out to her. And then he walks up to her and he says, don't cry. And the reason, to me, that story is so powerful is because this woman is not coming to Jesus on her own saying, would you heal my son? Or why did this happen? Or please listen to me. No, Jesus proactively sees her. He's interested in her interest. She's consumed with the death of her son. Jesus sees that. And so this instruction from Paul is not just arbitrary. It's not just, just do this to be nice. Or, hey, everybody needs to become a therapist because they're the good listeners. No, he's saying if you're a disciple of Jesus and you're taking some steps along the journey, that's great. But if you want to be really mature and like go to the next level of following the way of Jesus, it's going to happen with how you interact with other people. In other words, stop being a black hole. Because the opposite of a black hole is what? A sun or star. And you're actually shining light on other people. And they're getting better because of the loving, benevolent attention you are giving them. So let's pause again and reflect on the text that we just read. I'd like to give you some really practical tools for just how to do this on a day-to-day basis. So this is not the deepest, most theological teaching here, but this is more just how do we actually talk and listen to people? I've read some studies that since, this is so sad, basically since COVID, social skills across the board are going downhill. So we're not interacting as much. Obviously, our phones have a lot to do with it. We don't know how to be face to face with another human and be as adept at that as previous generations. So here I want to give you three common mistakes that we tend to make, and then three really helpful biblical practices in learning to listen to people the way that Jesus listened to people. Okay, common mistake number one. It's the pitfall of one-upping. So I'm sure you've had this happen to you many times. You might have been the one that did this to somebody else, but you're in a conversation and somebody tells a story and it's a pretty interesting story, but someone else says, "Oh, I'll do you one better." I mean, it is crazy how disempowering one-upping is to the person that shared the initial story. So someone shares a medical story about something terrible that happened to him. I had heart attack and bypass surgery, and someone else, well, I had quadruple bypass surgery. It happens all the time, and it's very disempowering, and it pulls the attention onto yourself. So beware of one-upping. The second one is a little more not as known, or I find when I talk about it. I call it the inside joke fail. And here's what it is. Imagine that you got 10 people around a dinner table and having a good conversation. Well, all of a sudden, two of them turn to each other and they start laughing hysterically about something. I have some distant family members that do this often at holidays, and it's so awkward for the rest of the group because we're all like, what are you talking about? Like, what is so funny? Like, everybody else stops talking because they're laughing so hard. Well, again, it might be great for them. They were the ones that were there with whatever memory we're talking about. But for everybody else, they feel like an outsider. Again, this one happens all the time. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're in a group and you're talking and you have some story or memory with somebody else, there's really two options to avoid this particular pitfall. Number one is just don't bring it up in the group. Wait till it's just the two of you, and then you can laugh all day long about whatever your inside joke is. Or two, share it with the group. Involve everybody else. Hey, we're talking about this thing that happened 2 years ago when we were taking this road trip and we pulled off to the side of the road, and then the skunk, like whatever it is, just envelop everybody else into the inside joke. So that's pitfall number two. So you got one-upping, you got the inside joke fail. And the third one I just call ball hogging. And it is what it sounds like. So I don't play as much anymore, but I used to play a lot of pickup basketball, and my least favorite kind of player to play with is the kind of guy where when I pass him the ball, I know for a fact it's not coming back to me or anybody else. He's just going to take it, and he's going to take two dribbles, and he's going to shoot the shot no matter if it's good or a bad shot. Those kinds of players are really boring to play with because once you pass the ball, it's like, well, I got two options. I can either run in for an offensive rebound, but I'm a pretty small guy, so I think I'm just going to check out and go back to the other side and play some defense. Now, my favorite kind of player to play with it's the person that he's just so aware of the movement of all of his teammates, and he's always looking for who's cutting and who's setting the screen. Is there going to be a backdoor cut? And when I'm playing with someone like that, I'm so engaged because I'm always aware that the ball might come back to me. Well, it's a metaphor for conversation. Some of us, and again, I know some of this is personality and it's not the worst thing in the world, but some of us have just become absolute ball hogs when it comes to conversation. So if you find yourself talking to someone and you're 10 minutes in and you've been talking for 9 of those 10 minutes, it's probably time to share the ball. Like that other person probably didn't sign up thinking they were going to listen to you for 90% of the time. So it's actually, I think it's on the ball hog to be the one to invite someone else in, and you do that by asking a question. Well, what do you think about this, or what about you, or when did this happen to you? You've got to be able to give the conversation to somebody else. So there's your 3 common mistakes, social failures we could call them. Now here's 3 practices which will really help us do what Paul's talking about in Philippians chapter 2. So the first one, and I'm actually going to, I think these go in order of difficulty, and this is just based on my personal experience. The first one is super important, and I think it's the easiest, though. It's just the discipline of encouragement. You know that feeling when somebody says something to you at just the right time, and it means the world to you. Someone comments on a presentation that you did at work, and you worked really hard on it, and they let you know how much they enjoyed that, or someone just comments on something you're wearing, and honestly, you've tried on 5 shirts and you didn't know what to wear, and you felt really insecure about it, but that one person said, "Wow, I really like it." I know that sounds superficial, but it feels good. And so you never know who God might want to encourage through you. So I just be lavish with it. Like when you get to the end of your life, are you ever going to regret being encouraging to other people? I'm always trying to look for what do I notice in other people that I can tell them, wow, that was great. Thanks for saying that. Thanks for doing that. I noticed when you went up and talked to that girl. I noticed that you were generous with it. I'm always looking for what I can point out that's good. And I feel like part of that's our job as Christians is to point out, like, this is the evidence of God that I can see in your life. And it's biblical. I mean, Scripture says in other places, encourage one another daily. That's one. Number 2 is really hard. Sounds easy. It is so hard. Practice curiosity. That's all it is. Now, I know that sounds easy, but based on, I've been in ministry 20 years, and most people aren't good at this. They assume that this is just something that journalists do or therapists do. Anybody can do this. I almost think about imagine going to some European country and exploring an empty castle with a torch. And so you're going into every hallway, and you're going down a spiral staircase into the basement, and then you're going up to the roof, and you're seeing all sorts of interesting archways, and that'd be really fun. Well, think about people like castles, that every person you meet is an infinite mystery. And so as one author I read last year, David Brooks, says, if everybody's a mystery, it's really important to live your life in the form of a question. And so as you talk to people, just explore. Well, like one of my favorite questions, well, what's the origin of ... So if someone talks to you about that they really enjoy doing yard work, well, what's the origin to that? Or they tell you about their favorite book of the Bible. Well, how did you come to Philippians being the favorite book of the Bible for you? If you were to interview someone, you could probably come up with a list of questions you'd want to ask them. Well, it doesn't have to be a formal interview when you're talking to people, but you can be better at this than you think. Just stay curious. And so as someone is sharing something with you, just think, well, what else could I ask of this person? So number 1 is encouragement. Number 2 is curiosity. And honestly, Jesus, again, models really well here. So Jesus, knowing people's thoughts, several times in the Bible, Scripture says Jesus knew their thoughts, and yet he's always asking questions. In fact, he asked famously, do you want to get well? He asks, what do you want me to do for you? At one point, he asks a Pharisee, when they're talking about the Bible, he says, well, how do you read it? Jesus is always asking questions, and I don't necessarily think he asks because he needs to know. Sometimes I think he asks because we need to talk. Like that's the gift of a good question, is you are illuminating part of this person's life. So curiosity is one of the greatest gifts that you can give to somebody else. In fact, the third practice is very much related to the second practice. The third really helpful practice when it comes to listening, like Jesus listened, is simply what I call sustained interest. So encouragement might take 10 seconds. Curiosity might take a minute or two okay, I'm going to ask this person a good question. But sustained interest is this fuller version of curiosity in which you're going to stay dialed into that person's world for 5, 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, without having to pull it back into your own world. And that requires a lot of effort and a lot of energy, a lot of follow-up questions. But do you remember the last time that someone did that for you? It's such a blessing. My wife is one of the greatest listeners I've ever met. And when we were dating a long time ago, it's one of the reasons I fell in love with her. Is she was this gracious, gentle, benevolent spirit who, when I would talk about my life, she would just let me. And then she would probe and ask more questions and comment on various things. And she was so good at sustaining interest over time. And that made me feel so seen and heard and loved. This is one of the greatest gifts that you could possibly give to somebody else, is simply paying attention to them for a sustained period of time. One final image as we wrap up. Many people want to be like a disco ball. So disco balls are really cool. I was at a concert recently, and they had a disco ball in the middle of the stadium, and it just made the whole room sparkle with light. And disco ball people are really fun to be around. They're energetic and entertaining, and they tell stories, and they make people laugh. Like, I really like disco ball people. However, if you put 100 disco balls in a room with no other lights, then what happens to that room? Well, ironically, it goes totally dark, because disco balls actually need spotlights in order to work. They need someone else shining the light on them so they can rotate and give light to the rest of the room. And so what I've observed is that I know a lot of people that want to be the disco ball, and they want the attention. But if everybody's the disco ball, there's actually no light in the room. And so I think what we need more of, and for reading a passage like this really carefully, we need more spotlights. People like Barnabas in the New Testament, people like Paul, people like Jesus, who don't have to always have the light on themselves, but have learned the spiritual discipline of putting the spotlight onto somebody else. That is so important. And imagine what that does to a group of friends. Imagine what that does to a church if more and more people start to practice this gift of curiosity to other people. I really do think it starts to fundamentally change people, to change groups. In fact, a few years ago, scientists discovered this. There was this like ripple that they experienced. I don't know how to describe it. This ripple in the universe is what I read about it. One of these big systems with all the antennas caught this in the universe. Like, they didn't know what it was. Like, where did this come from? It's almost like something had happened in the past, and it had jarred a lot of the atmosphere and molecules in the universe. And so all these scientists got together and they tried to figure out what it was. Well, here's what it was. Sometime, a long time ago, millions or billions, I don't know how long ago, two black holes collided. And so they created this terrible negative energy that's been rippling throughout the universe all these years later. So imagine when people, like if I'm a black hole, just me, and if you're a black hole, if we get together, that's not good. It's not good for churches, it's not good for social groups, it's not good for your development. But the opposite is a cluster of stars. In fact, there's one particular cluster of stars I was reading about. It's like 150,000 stars in this really close proximity in the universe, and it's so bright. And so can you imagine, just at your church or in your small group, in your friend group, if quite a few of you decide, I'm going to be a spotlight. I'm going to be the person that's going to shine light on other people. Can you imagine how much light that brings to that group? I'm telling you, this particular practice has so much potential to make a massive difference in your life personally and in the life of your church. Let's pause one last time and discuss.